Hello and welcome to Critical Line Item. My name's Tom Ravlick and thank you for joining me for this podcast. One of the features of this period during which we've had the coronavirus pandemic is the creativity with which some people tell the story of why the pandemic came to be. And there's all sorts of theories, whether it's uh, Bill Gates creating something, or whether it's there are issues with the way in which Anthony Fauci has run um, a national institute in the United States related to health. There are all sorts of what we would call conspiracy theories. That is, theories that people have about why it is something has turned out. Typically not an official version, typically something that's been hammered out in the back of somebody's mind, and these days more likely than not spread across Twitter. Um, but we need to explain this to people in a better way. So I've got an associate professor in cognitive science from the University of Western Australia who's joining me today, Ullrich Ecker. Now, Ullrich has been teaching and researching the area for some time and recently published an article with a series of co-authors deconstructing pandemic, um, looking at 7 traits of conspiratorial thinking. So Ulrich will take us through that and a few other pieces along the way. Ulrich, thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Tommy. Thanks for having me.
Okay, not a problem. Absolute pleasure. Before we go on to the topic of the day, your title is Associate Professor of Cognitive Science. What exactly does that knowledge area entail?
All right. Well, cognitive science is sort of a bit of an umbrella term. It encompasses all kinds of approaches to understanding thinking. So this could be cognitive psychology, experimental psychology. This is what I usually do. We conduct experiments to find out how people think, how they make decisions. But it can also be building mathematical or computational models of the mind to sort of try and mimic human decision making or even animal cognition. So yeah, it's just an umbrella term for a variety of approaches to find out more about how we think, the way we think, and what kind of biases we have, and so on.
How did you get into the area of looking at misinformation as part of the work you do uh, in your role?
Yeah, I guess there's part of it is that I just sort of stumbled into it. I was always interested in human memory, and that's what I sort of did for my PhD. Um, and I did some clinical work with people where I noticed that people just had a strong inclination to keep believing what they wanted to believe. So I got interested in how people update their memory and how they revise their knowledge, and that actually tapped into a lot of older memories. So, for example, my mother died when I was quite young of cancer. And my grandmother was all about herbal teas and trying to heal cancer with herbal tea. And that just didn't sit right with me as a child, and it doesn't sit right with me today. So there's a few personal things that kind of made it particularly appealing to me. So if I see someone arguing something that is objectively not true and can actually cause harm, I can't be quiet. So this was a very good career choice for me. So I now can study why people believe in things they shouldn't actually believe in, and yeah, I think that's what provides me with my motivation, I guess.
You've been blessed in some respects with an enormous amount of material to
Mm.
pick off over the past 6 months with the uh, um, with the with the commentary and debate surrounding COVID-19. Before we go into the 7 traits that you and colleagues have put forward in the article, what are the observations that you would make about the way in which the discourse has flowed over the past while?
Well, I think the crucial one is that this is just such a time of such huge uncertainty and a major threat, and a threat that has asked a lot of us in terms of we needed to adapt and change our behavior and accept restrictions. So it's been a massive challenge. So it's not surprising that people go out there and try to look for answers, right? And we're now in an environment where we sort of used to getting answers quickly, right? You can just Google stuff while you're on the phone, right? You can answer questions quickly. We're just used to that now. So in situations like this, where there's so much uncertainty, and even the experts, they need to spend some time doing the research and trying to understand what's going on. They can't give um, clear answers quickly, and neither can political leaders. They can't give. They struggled initially to decide what to do and what evidence to trust and so on and so forth. So in that kind of situation where there's huge uncertainty, it's not surprising that people long for answers. They want some certainty around what's going to happen, and it was pretty obvious that these conspiracy theories would pop up because they can offer sort of quick answers, whereas the answers that are based in evidence, the answers that are based in examination of what's actually going on, they just take longer to develop.
And
Sorry, my
is
dog
that in
started to
part?
bark.
That's all right. That's all right. I'll take a contribution from anybody, including the boss of the house. But if you've got taking your point that you've made that people have a gap in knowledge, um, there's a there's a missing link between what they're struggling with and the cause. Um, Is there a compulsion from what you've studied for people to fill the gap with almost anything that seems plausible at that time?
Yeah, I think that's true of some people. People differ in the amount of uncertainty they sort of tolerate willingly. They differ in the amount of ambiguity that they're willing to accept. And some people have a more, a stronger demand to sort of understand their environment, and they might be sort of particularly vulnerable to that kind of thinking. I mean, we're naturally suspicious and afraid of things that don't have an obvious explanation. So, in times of confusion, we all want answers. It's not just a subgroup of people. Everyone's like that. Everyone dislikes uncertainty. We just vary a little bit in the extent to which we can tolerate uncertainty. So for some
So
people,
there's a
they just want answers. Other people are happy to sort of sit back and say, okay, I don't know what's going on. I'll just take a step back. I'll follow the advice, and we'll just see how it pans out.
when we consider what you just said, you've got some people might have a better risk appetite and can wear the issues well, but other people don't have the same degree of a appetite for risk, and they're looking for an explanation. Um, are those people susceptible uh, to some of the characters in various groups that exist online uh, to draw them in with a particular story? Now, there are multiples with COVID-19, as we're both aware. Uh, are they vulnerable to some kind of, shall we say, a kind of a radicalization once they go down a rabbit hole with one kind of explanation?
That certainly can happen. So I mean, there's data out there that suggests that at least 50% of people in the US, for example, believe in one or the other conspiracy theory. But that's not to say that everyone is really engaged with those conspiracy theories. It depends a little bit on how you measure it. So sometimes uh, the scales that are given to people are sort of constructed in a way that makes it very easy for people to agree. So they might have one option saying, here's a conspiracy theory. How much do you believe it? And the scale might say, I don't believe it. And then I might believe it a little bit. I believe it, a little bit more. And then I'll believe it moderately. I believe it quite strongly. And then I fully believe it. So there's like 5 or 6 options reflecting various degrees of belief, and only one that says, I don't believe it. So sometimes they use those scales, and even people who then indicate that they might consider it possible and they might believe it a little bit. They're not quite sure it's not true. Even those people are often counted when they release these statistics saying how many people believe in conspiracy theory X, right? So that's not really a proper way of measuring belief. So not everyone who falls into that category will actually have, a substantial belief in that conspiracy theory. Plus, just believing, if someone doubts that, I don't know, we really landed on the moon, well, okay, you can believe that. It's not going to really cause any harm. It's not going to cause any issues, right? So not everyone who believes in the odd conspiracy theory is being totally irrational or is someone who's causing harm. It's only a very small, tiny fragment of the population who really believes in these conspiracy theories, and they tend to believe in multiple conspiracy theories, even if those are contradictory. Um, but yes, there is a chance that some people, slide down a slippery slope and they believe in one a little bit, and then they believe in another one, and they start digging. And of course, on the internet, now that everyone is connected, you can find evidence, quote unquote, um, for anything that you want, pretty much, right? The Earth is flat, whatever. Like you can find like-minded people, even if it's just a few, that will sort of amplify that belief. So there is that risk of radicalization. There is the risk that if you believe in some conspiracy a little bit, that you start digging and you end up fully embracing it and starting maybe to even create your own and spreading them around, and that does happen. But we do need to keep in mind that we're talking about a, a quite small segment of the population that is just creating an extraordinary amount of noise.
You mentioned the internet and social media. Um those are vehicles, or if you like, mediums
Hmm.
through which these things get amplified. 2 decades ago, Twitter and Facebook didn't exist,
Yeah.
and the ability of conspiracy theories to get past, shall we say, traditional gatekeepers like mainstream media was not there. Now it can be almost within seconds. Somebody could publicize elements of a conspiracy theory without any gatekeeper being between the um, the messenger, or the sender of the message, and the recipient. If we look at traditional communications theory,
Mm.
um, is there have you noticed anything in your research about how, whether those who deal with uh, the conspiracy theories turn away from mainstream media and just rely on the narrowcast social media?
Yeah. Look, I think there's two separate developments here. One is that many people are turning away from mainstream media, not intentionally, but just as a matter of habit, right? Um, for example, I use Twitter professionally, so I tweet about my work. But when I go there to tweet about my work or read, what my colleagues are doing, I learn a lot from my colleagues over Twitter. I'm also exposed to the news because I follow some um, you know news organizations on Twitter. So I don't actually read the newspaper as much as I used to. I don't watch the TV news as much as I used to because I'm getting my information elsewhere. So it's just uh, a shift away from the mainstream media, I guess. Even though the news that I receive on Twitter is mainly from the mainstream media because I follow various outlets. But other people, it might be more secondhand news that they're getting, or less traditional, not so mainstream media organizations. So that's the gradual shift that has happened anyway, sort of slightly away from mainstream media. Um, but then, yes, of course, if you're a conspiratorial thinker or you believe in conspiracy theories, you're not going to get the information that you want from mainstream media because they will typically not uh, really, be an outlet for conspiracy theories. They'll try and cover the news as best they can. So you're not getting what you want, so you're turning elsewhere. So yes, of course, conspiratorial thinkers will turn away from mainstream media, and in fact, obviously the mainstream media, uh, to many of them, is the enemy, and they're just out there allegedly spreading fake news, and they're actually trying to find the truth in their own perception.
One of the interesting things I noticed about the work that you, you and colleagues have obviously done looking at pandemic is and for those who don't know, there was a video about 26 minutes long that was put together by a production company that interviewed a lady that's a discredited um, uh, immune slash viral researcher by the name of Judy Milkovich, and that video was ripped off social media platforms, but it ended up in my Facebook Messenger on multiple occasions, and people asked me to watch it. I watched it for a couple of minutes and realised what was going on. Um, how long did it take all of you to sort of look through the video and nut out how those elements fit with the various flags, if you like, for conspiracy theories?
Yeah, that didn't take too long actually. um, the we've been looking at this for some time, and we've um, the two people doing most of the work in that article you mentioned, John Cook and Stephen Lewandowski, published a conspiracy theory handbook well before the pandemic video struck. So that was just um, one sort of thing that we could look at and see if, the those 7 traits of conspiratorial thinking that we claimed sort of applied to that video as well. So yeah, there's various other pieces that we looked at. They're not difficult to find at the moment, and then we can look at the extent to which people spreading those conspiracy theories show those 7 traits, and they will do that to varying degrees. But yeah, they're pretty. It's like a template. They pretty much use the same techniques all the time, which is exactly why we're interested in highlighting those. We're not interested to sort of highlight those traits to make fun of people or to discredit them. That's not the main aim. The main aim is to help people understand what kind of misleading argumentation strategies those people are using um, to mislead the public. And by better understanding what those traits are, it means that people can be better prepared when they encounter such content down the line into the future, right? So we call this inoculation, sort of a term we obviously borrowed from the more medical side of things. But the idea is that we try to provide access to sort of a weakened form of the disinformation, of the conspiracy theories, to sort of tease apart what kind of misleading strategies are being used and why they're flawed, so people can identify them down the track and be better protected. Obviously, it's really important to have good media literacy at the moment to sort of really be skeptical and question, okay, what am I being told here? What's the agenda? Is there evidence that this is just trying to mislead me or spread a conspiracy theory?
Yeah, it's an interesting group of 7 categories. So we can go through them one by one just to clarify to people what they are. The first one you've got on the list where you looked at pandemic is contradictory beliefs. So that to me suggests that there's no internal consistency with what a conspiracy theorist might think. Am I correct in asserting that?
Exactly. So conspiracy theorists will use whatever evidence um, they think will serve their purpose, and whether that evidence is internally consistent is doesn't matter, right? So they are happy to use contradictory arguments if the arguments serve their cause. So the famous example that we use is that you can believe that Princess Diana was murdered, or you can believe that she faked her own death, but those two things can't be true at the same time, right? And we see those things over and over again where um, uh, you know people have put arguments forward that are mutually incompatible. So that's one telltale sign of someone trying to push their opinion on you without actual good evidence.
Yeah, and you the conversation, your piece, and we'll mention it again at the end of the podcast for people to go and look at it, or do a quick Google search and look at it. And you've got the notion of overriding suspicion, which to me suggests, uh, i- well, it's actually a more polite term for paranoia, is it not?
Well, I wouldn't call it paranoia. I would say, like, sometimes conspiracy theorists or people defending them will say, well, aren't they just being skeptical, right? Um, and I say, no, that's not what they're doing, because a true skeptic will look at evidence skeptically, right? They will look for additional evidence from elsewhere to maybe, see whether what they have in front of them stacks up. And then they will make their own decision. They will look at it and say, okay, so this evidence is very weak, so I'm not going to believe it. Or they will say, oh, this is surprising. I didn't know that this was true, but the evidence seems quite strong, so I'm now going to change my mind. Right. So a true skeptic will as objectively as possible, uh, evaluate the evidence and then be open to changing their mind if they perceive the evidence to be persuasive. A conspiracy theorist will be hyper skeptical, almost nihilistically skeptical towards anything to do with the official account, or the evidence that is put forward to support that account, while at the same time being extremely gullible towards anything that fits their narrative. Right? So it's not true skepticism, it's what we call motivated reasoning. They're motivated to come to a particular conclusion, and hence they cherry pick the evidence as they like it. So they're sort of pretending to be skeptical, but all they are is they have an overriding sense of suspicion towards anything to do with the official account, while at the same time being very gullible for anything that suits their purposes.
And it then leads quite nicely, or segues quite nicely into number three, being nefarious intent. Tell me a bit about that.
Right. So basically, it means that the conspiracy theorist will always assume that the motivations behind the presumed conspiracy are nefarious. People are out there to, take over the world or kill a certain segment of the population or whatever it might be. Right. It's always ill intent. And that's actually an interesting point, because, of course, there are real conspiracies sometimes, right? We know that. There's first thing that comes to mind now is sort of the Watergate scandal, because I just watched Vice, the movie with Christian Bale. Uh, Great movie, by the way. Where there is a real conspiracy by certain people to achieve a certain aim, but that's usually uncovered through investigative journalism or whistleblowers, things like that. But sometimes there are also real conspiracies that have. I mean, Watergate obviously had a bit of a malicious intent, but there are conspiracies, real conspiracies that actually have a good purpose. Like if a group of people conspire to kill a dictator or take down a dictator, whatever it might be. So there can be conspiracies, real conspiracies, where there is benign intent. But for conspiracy theorists, those conspiracy theories that are put forward, there will always be nefarious intent assumed.
Is there a, is there a heightened in this context? Is there a heightened distrustable authority across the board?
I don't think it's across the board. So if you look at surveys in Australia, for example, there's still extremely high trust in um, medical professionals, in health workers, in scientists. There's
Mm.
very high levels of trust. Of course, there's other uh, you know people where trust levels are lower, and that is quite unfortunate, especially with regards to political leaders and other elites, where there are good reasons to be skeptical of many people in those areas. There's good reasons to be um, a bit distrusting. There's just too much corruption and nepotism and things going on where people go, we've had so many royal commissions into, God knows what. But of course, people are not trusting, right? Because they have good reasons not to trust, and that's in this particular circumstance of the pandemic. That's particularly damaging, because what we would need now is leaders whom are trusted, who can communicate transparently and honestly with the public, and that would prevent a whole lot of damage, right? So you can't blame people for not trusting politicians, because, frankly, many politicians have not earned the trust, and it takes a long time to build trust. It's quickly destroyed, and unfortunately, the way politics have played out in this country and in many other countries over the last decades, trust has been eroded. But again, people who really distrust the media, who really distrust science as a whole, they're actually sort of relatively rare. I think trust levels there are still reasonably high in science and scientists, in health professionals, in some mainstream media outlets like the ABC, for example, have reasonably high trust levels. I understand some conservative people think the ABC is maybe a bit left-leaning. There's also left-leaning people who think the ABC sometimes provides too much sort of false balance when they cover certain things. And I'm the first person to say that some of the mainstream news are just not, great. I would say on TV and so on. So yeah, it's not perfect. I think we should really, as a country, invest more in a strong and independent media. And it doesn't matter if they're left leaning or right leaning, as long as they're really trying to provide the news in a fact-based, evidence-based manner. And I think many Australians still still trust those institutions. But unfortunately, as I said earlier, in other areas such as trust in politicians and so on, trust has been eroded quite broadly, and for good reason. So that's a bit unfortunate.
That I guess to my point in looking at distrust in institutions is in some ways um, to test whether distrust in institutions leads people to fall into the trap of believing a conspiracy theory more.
Oh yeah, of course. Like if you distrust what politicians are telling you, if you distrust what scientists are telling you, and unfortunately, again, there's fraudulent scientists, right, who try and get a big publication out prematurely, and that damages trust in science, and it's terrible, right? But by and large, scientists are trying to do the right thing and trying to get evidence-based recommendations. But yeah, if you don't trust politicians, if you don't trust what scientists are telling you, if you don't trust what the media are telling you, well, of course, where's that going to leave you, right? If you don't trust any of those, then you go online, you seek alternative viewpoints, and you put your trust in them, and that's unfortunate because I think at the current moment, the scientists and medical officers and dare I say it, many politicians actually have our best interests at heart. I disagree with a lot of things that politicians say and the way things are being done here and there. But still, by and large, I have a sense that there's some people out there who really actually only have our best interests at heart, and not all of them are just out there to just look after themselves. But again,
Mhm.
trust in some politicians has eroded for good reasons, and that's
I think
really unfortunate.
it's interesting having covered that off. We've gotten to the fourth bullet point in the seven. Um, drops us into a notion that conviction that something is wrong, even though there's no evidence something is wrong. There's um, uh, something doesn't seem right. Uh, tell me a bit about that particular.
Yeah.
Tell me a bit about that
So
particular point.
again, if we compare a true skeptic with a conspiracy theorist, someone who's really skeptical about the evidence they receive, they will see evidence and they will look at more evidence and they will come to a conclusion that this all points in one direction, so something must be wrong. I've got to do some further investigation. Whereas a conspiracy theorist will sort of almost start with a premise that something must be wrong. They have a hunch, something must be wrong, and then they start gathering evidence to support that conclusion, right? And then the way they gather that evidence is, of course, through cherry picking or other tactics to sort of only pay attention to those things that confirm their notion that something is wrong. And even if you change their mind on one particular piece of evidence, they might change their mind on that and agree and say, okay, I can no longer claim this, but I can still hold on to the overarching notion that something must be wrong. And I'll just find another piece of evidence that suits my argument.
Now there's a number 5 of 7. It feels like a bit of a Billboard top 40 countdown, but number 5 is fascinating to me. It's the one concerning persecuted victims. Um, is there always some kind of persecuted victim in a conspiracy theory?
Probably not always. Yeah, there's certainly some out there where that's maybe not, one of the primary traits. But you do often get a sense when you read into these conspiracy theories that the theorists behind those sort of present themselves or perceive themselves as victims of some sort of organized persecution. So, the government is after us. They don't want us to do this or say that or whatever. They're actively, persecuting us. And at the same time, they often present themselves or see themselves as sort of, the brave antagonists who are sort of taking on the evil-minded conspirators, right? So it's basically often a self-perception of simultaneously being a victim and a hero, so to speak, right? But yeah, again, that doesn't apply to all conspiracy theories, but as soon as they start talking about, okay, Bill Gates is trying to get these microchips into us so he can at some point somehow control us or kill us or whatever, right? There's this idea of there's this really mighty person who has the capability to control us all and come after us, and we need to stand up, otherwise we might get killed because they're believing in decimating the population. So there is that flavor of we're the persecuted victims here, but it's not omnipresent. It's not in each and every conspiracy theory. It's just sort of a general theme that runs across quite a few of them.
Now there's something before we get on to the last two. There's something that I've noticed in the discussion about COVID and COVID measures that possibly also plays into some of the rhetoric of conspiracy. One of the things we, certainly in Melbourne, we now have, there are those who call the, this thing we've got between 8 p.m. and 5 a.m. A curfew,
Mm-hmm.
and other people call it house arrest.
Yeah.
Uh, is there in terms of language and amplification and casting a negative on some of this, um, eh, there's a lot of that in some of the conspiracy theories too, isn't there?
Yeah, it's this general notion of, they're coming and they're controlling us. They're coming after us to, not necessarily punish us, but to control us and restrict our freedoms, right? So that's that sense of
Yeah.
persecution, where of course, the leaders really couldn't care less about what you do at night. It's not about controlling you or restricting any kind of freedom. I mean, people are now construing wearing a mask as a restriction of their freedom. I mean, that's that goes into territory where you can just kind of shake your head and go like, I think you've never experienced actual restriction of your freedom, right? Because that's not, wearing a mask is not that. So it's the sense of, are they now controlling our lives, they're taking over, where, in actual fact, all it is a measure designed to help, prevent infection. And it's not about just, preventing infection for yourself. it's also about, if you get infected, who else are you going to pass it on to? We chatted about this just earlier when you first called me. Um, you know, just because a young person is not going to die, it doesn't mean it doesn't matter that they get the virus, because they could pass it on to someone who's more vulnerable. Um, and that might end up, you never know. The person going into Bunnings without the mask, uh, great. They argue there's a restriction on their freedom and so on, but really it's not um, about whether or not you're going to get it. It's about, if you go out and you don't follow the regulations, and you might have the virus without you knowing, who else are you going to pass it on to? Even if you're safe, if you're young, if you're fit and healthy, even if you don't get many symptoms or a mild case, um, even though those mild cases sound pretty horrific by what I'm hearing from those who had them. It's about, who else are you going to pass it on? Maybe not even directly. You're part of a chain, and you might not pass it on. You might pass it on to a person who'll be fine, who's going to pass it on to another person who's also going to be fine, but they might pass it on to someone who then dies. And that whole chain could have been stopped by you just putting on a mask. I don't think that's too much to ask, right? So, yeah, it's that
Yeah.
sense of, no one can take control of me. But guess what, right? There's regulations in place all over the place that restrict your so-called freedoms, right? You get into the car, you wear a seatbelt. It's not trying to restrict your movement in the car. It's trying to prevent injury, right? Trying to prevent death, and very successfully so, which eventually ends up in a public health cost if there's lots of injuries and lots of deaths, right? We don't want that, so we regulate it to wear seatbelts. And of course, they're little, restricting your movement in the car a little bit, but hey, that's a very, very tiny price to pay, right, for the benefits that it means for the common good. And the same is true of the masks.
Yeah. But you've just spoken about, sort of the notion of evidence, right?
Mm,
You've said that there are things that there are things that exist, that have, because of their introduction, stopped people from, you know, dying prematurely.
mhm.
But number six in this particular list of things conspiracy theorists do quite well is that they're immune to evidence as opposed to being immune to a virus. Um, can you explain that to the listeners?
Yeah, I think that's possibly the most important or the most obvious trait of conspiratorial thinking, is that those conspiracy theories are inherently self-sealing. You cannot provide any evidence that will counter it, because any evidence will be reinterpreted, right? So if you come and say, well, there's, for example, there's quite a big number of COVID deaths in Sweden, yet Sweden doesn't have a 5G network, right? So that would be, on my eyes at least, or objectively, a pretty strong piece of evidence that 5G cannot cause the virus, right, or the disease COVID. Um,
Yeah,
but a conspiracy theorist would just turn that against you and say, well, that's what they're telling you, right? They'll still have mobile phones in Sweden, and you would have to say yes, of course. They would say, well, they just secretly snuck in the 5G into Sweden without anyone knowing, or whatever, right? They'll make something up. So whatever evidence you present will be turned around, and eventually, if you continue to argue that no, that can't be true, right? There's documented evidence that Sweden does, not have a 5G network. Then, if they can't make any headway against your argument, they will, go against the person, and will just then say, well, you're obviously part of the sheeple. You're part of the conspiracy yourself in a manner, because you just
you're a sheep, which is the classic. Yeah,
yeah.
it's a classic. There's somebody that's been putting pictures of sheep, of a sheep, um, in response to some of the posts on Facebook that I've seen, and it is really interesting to see what you've literally said just now, replicated in, mm, the social media. If we can call it propaganda, which is what it is.
Mm,
Um, by somebody putting people down to say that they're sheep because
Yeah,
they're following an official version,
yeah. There's, I
not
mean,
not having any regard. Yeah,
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 there's,
not having any regard for the fact that people are probably following the sane version of events.
yeah. I mean, there's two facets in that, right? One is that an additional reason why people join these conspiracy theory circles is that it gives them a sense of community, right? They're, you know, then with like-minded people, they can um, use social media posts or stickers on their car, or whatever, to communicate to the community that they're part of this uh, other group that uh, you know pretends to have all the answers. So it gives them this sort of sense of community, which everyone's lacking at the moment, especially if you're in lockdown, right? We've lost a lot of those community connections. So and a lot of people do feel marginalized in today's society, and this gives them a sense of community, right? So that's one aspect. But the second aspect is, as you said, putting other people down, making I'm part of the enlightened community, right? I'm part of the better community, and everyone else is just a sheep, right? So it's this I'm better than you, and that serves to bolster people's you know view of their self, their self esteem, their so that's another psychological function of that, um, to sort of demonstrate to others I'm better than you and I'm the enlightened group. But also we must not forget that there's a lot of disinformation out there, and it's not just created by the guy in his basement or his bedroom with a tinfoil hat just making stuff up. Some of this content is really created and designed by malicious actors who really want to go out there and sow division, right? And they're achieving that quite well. I read an article the other day about um, interference of Russian social media accounts in the US, not about an election or anything, but they're out there spreading anti-vax information in the US. And now you go, what kind of interest would a Russian agency have to spread anti-vax information in the US? Well, where's the immediate benefit there? Where's the allure? Where's the motivation? Right? But I believe the motivation is that a lot of that disinformation that is being spread out and amplified via social media is to sow division. And I think Russia has a general interest in bringing down or weakening all Western democracies. And that's one way to do that. The more division you sow, um, the more people turn against each other. You get strong polarization. And the more we end up in a situation as we're seeing now in the US, which arguably is not, the sort of strong version of a democratic society that most of us sort of aspire towards. So there's that element, right? And again, look, um, sorry, I lost my train of thought there, but yeah.
But there's also the final one that we're looking at is reinterpreting randomness, uh, and it's quite interesting. You in the article, you and your colleagues talk about it being conspiracy theorists being able to come up with some sort of interpretation of a pattern that gives this thing life.
Hmm.
How does that work?
Well, okay. People differ um, in their inclination to see meaning in random events, and again, humans have evolved to find patterns, right? We're very good pattern detectors. Um, but some people more than others really see patterns where there are none, and they see meaning in random patterns and random events. Um, and for many people, having a big event like this pandemic, it kind of feels like it also needs a big explanation. They're just not satisfied with, well, it just happened. We're not really quite sure how, um, right? Or we know a little bit, but we don't know everything. Um, they kind of that doesn't sit comfortably with them, right? There's a big event; it must have a big explanation, and they will therefore reinterpret small random events as fitting their narrative, right? Um, yeah, so tiny details can be reinterpreted. Um, one example that comes to mind is that after the 9/11 attacks, there were still some intact windows at the Pentagon, right? So in photos, they saw those intact windows and said, well, that's proof that there was, that was sort of an inside job, or it didn't really happen, or whatever their conspiracy theory might be, right? So they take some tiny detail and they reinterpret it to support their preferred version of the narrative.
Those 7 points in the article, the seven, I guess, red flags, if I can call it that, for what conspiracy theories do, fascinating. Uh, You're someone who's been in the literature deeply. You've looked at the research. You're looking at the issues. What are, in summing up all of what we've spoken about, what are the things that people out there uh, should keep in mind at the current time with all of the information they're seeing about COVID-19, particularly?
Yeah, let me preface that with just saying that it is genuinely difficult at this time to sort of navigate and make sense of what is really a complex information landscape. Now, that was true already before COVID. It's become even
Yep.
more true now. It's just very difficult to really piece together any, the evidence that is out there and to come to a conclusion. And a lot of that is because many things are just not quite known yet, right? We don't know exactly how effective masks are if they're homemade, and how many layers they have, and like you can tell they make a little bit of a difference. And the numbers in Europe, where there's been a lot of mask wearing recently, and also in Asia, uh, the modeling shows that the masks did have a big effect, right? But it's not, you can't be 100% certain how much protection they give, right? It might be, you know, 60% or 30% or 70% or 10%. We don't really know exactly how much protection they offer. All we know is that all the evidence suggests that they do make a difference, right? And therefore, it has been recommended to use them outdoors in at least some parts of the country now, right? But it's difficult to come to that conclusion because there's a lot of conflicting evidence, and we're really just working it out, right? And that's a slow process that requires some research. So just wanted to preface that with, it is genuinely difficult. But at the same time, there's a lot of little pointers that you can look out for, right? You can look out for those 7 traits of conspiratorial thinking. So if someone um, is out there and seems to be reinterpreting uh, minute details about something, then right, that's maybe a first sign that maybe what this person is telling me is not grounded in good evidence. So you can look out for those seven traits of conspiratorial thinking. Uh, you can also look out for other things, right? What's the source of this information? What evidence are they providing? How trustworthy is this source? Might they have a hidden agenda? Right? Look at who's spreading this, right? Who do they work for? What kind of outlet is this? What is their purpose? Uh, and unless I'm sure that something is actually genuine and true, and at least tries to sort of strike a balanced picture, should I really be sharing it, right? Because you might be, causing some harm by sharing things that are false. So just being a little bit skeptical and just taking that 10 seconds to think before acting and sharing something, or just skimming the headline and liking it or believing it. Just taking a little bit of time to sort of you know get the brain juices flowing and say, okay, hang on a second, right? Is this really true? Let me just Google it and see if I can find some other evidence from a different source that confirms that. What do other people say about this? What exactly is the source? Where is this stuff coming from? Um, you know, uh, Even things like reverse image searches. There's a lot of images being used that are taken. For example, recently in the US, there were quite a few images where people said, "Oh, look, the Black Lives Matter protesters are now vandalizing this or that." And then when you looked at the image and did a reverse image search, you found that that image was actually 2 years old and from a different country or different protest or whatever. Right? So all these tricks are being used And therefore, it's important to just stop and think and be a little bit skeptical about what is presented to you. And also to be mindful of how the information that we receive through our social media feeds, how that is actually controlled by the algorithms of the social media platforms, which no one knows how they work. All we know is that they work with one and only one goal, which is to maximize engagement and hence advertising profit. That is the only thing that drives those algorithms, right? They're not designed to give you the truth, or they're not designed to give you the best evidence, right? They're designed to keep you engaging with the content as long as possible, as widely as possible, so advertising revenue of those companies can be maximized. Um, and that's just important to keep in mind, right? That the things that are fed to you through your social media are not a reflection of the actual state of the world. And look, a lot of people have some sense of that, but I also, in conversations with many people that I have, I notice that it doesn't always really sink in, or the extent of it doesn't really sink in. Everyone knows that, if you Google, you want to buy a pair, if where you can buy a new pair of shoes, that 2 seconds later you'll get an ad on Facebook with new shoes, right? Everyone knows that they're using these data
Yeah,
to and people might think, well, that's actually quite useful, and I agree, that can be quite useful, and it's pretty obvious. So that's not terrible. It's not. It's just clever marketing, and that's fine, right? We still live in a sort of free market society, and that's absolutely fine. But I think people underestimate the extent to which the algorithms determine what you actually see online. And actually, as sort of a conservative person who's worried about their freedom, that's what would make me crazy, that someone is actually controlling the information that I see and trying to subtly and implicitly change my beliefs and my behaviors, right? That's where I think, if you're worried about freedom, that's what you should be worried about, in my opinion. So I think that's something that people underestimate. Did you know, for example, that if you type a comment into Facebook without posting it, Facebook still gets that comment and it's part of their databases? I didn't know that. There's these things that we're just not aware of, but we should be aware of in to better navigate this complex information landscape.
it's interesting, and there's a lot of things for people to consider, Ulrich. And we've gone through a fairly substantial amount of material in the time we've spent together. Uh, for those individuals that want to have a look at the article I've been referring to throughout, it's an article called Deconstructing Pandemic. It's 7 traits of conspiratorial thinking. It was originally published on the Conversation website, wasn't it?
Yeah, the conversation has an open access, or they share their things around, so it's been published in a few places. But
Yeah.
yeah, originally on the conversation.
Yeah, so that's the piece Ulrich and I have been talking about. I recommend it highly for those people who want to have a look at it. There's also a video on YouTube where the 7 signs of conspiracy theorists, I guess, getting a little out of control, uh, is available for those of you that want to have a look. Ulrich, thank you so much for spending your time with me today. It's been an absolute pleasure to talking with you.
Pleasure's all mine, Tommy.
Thank you, and hopefully we can do so again. And to those of you listening, stay safe, look after each other, and we'll be back with another podcast reasonably soon.